records collection, and you can read it yourself. There's additional corroborating evidence of an entrance wound high above the right eye, and that's provided by a new evidence who has come forward since my book was published. I was contacted in the year 2010 by a person named Quentin Schwinn. He's a contractor with a high-level security clearance who works at one of the 8 NASA centers. He was once a student of photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology. He has a vivid recollection of being approached during what was clearly a job interview in late 1982 or early 1983, while he was a student at RIT. He was approached by one of his professors, a Professor David Hazy, and by an unknown stranger from out of town. The stranger had a briefcase. The stranger pulled out 2 photographs. One was a satellite image of airplanes parked on a runway, obviously taken from a great distance. And they asked Mr. Schwinn all kinds of photogrammetric questions about how would you determine the size of this airplane, the length of the wings, the length of these shadows. And apparently he satisfied them with his answers. He indicated to them that he had a good knowledge of photogrammetry and of photography and photographic analysis. They then showed him one color positive transparency, a postmortem image of JFK after death. And I spent 3 years off and on interviewing Mr. Schwinn on the phone, assessing his credibility. I even had him contact RIT, and I had them send me a sealed transcript of his matriculation there. I received a sealed transcript. I verified that he was in school there when he said he was. He did receive the 2 degrees in photography that he said he did. And my considered judgment after interviewing him for 3 years is that Quentin Schwinn is a reliable witness and that he was shown a postmortem image of President Kennedy, which is not in the official collection today, by 2 individuals as part of a recruitment pitch. By the way, he was subsequently offered 2 federal jobs in photography and declined both of them. But this event happened. And so this is what I encouraged him to do. This image is the result of Quentin Schwinn going to a qualified medical illustrator, describing for him what he recalls seeing in the image, and getting the medical illustrator to draw a picture. And I believe this is the 3rd or 4th attempt of the effort. I mean, Quentin Schwinn is a perfectionist, and he had, in fact, more than one artist work on the project, and he finally settled on the best artist. And then I think this is the 3rd attempt made by the 2nd artist. This is important for 2 reasons. One is the entrance wound, apparent entrance wound above the right eye, and the other reason is the condition of the throat wound, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. So this is the wound that apparently Dennis David and Joe O'Donnell recall seeing in photographs the week after the autopsy. I forwarded this image to Dennis David with a minimum of description and asked him if it was similar in any way to the photographs he was shown by Lieutenant Commander Pitzer. And he said the entrance wound above the right eye is exactly what he recalls. The condition of the throat wound is different, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, which is significant. But he said that the small entrance wound above the right eye is 100% consistent with the photographs shown to him by Lieutenant Commander Pitzer a week after JFK's death. Joe O'Donnell is now deceased, so I could not contact him. But this, I think, gives the viewer a good impression of an entry wound from a shot from the front, which was later removed from President Kennedy's skull by illicit, clandestine, postmortem surgery before the autopsy began. My considered conclusion after many years of thought is that bullet, which entered well above the right eye, that shot from the front, is not the cause of the blowout in the right rear of the head seen at Parkland Hospital. I believe this bullet, which entered in this location, exited high in the left rear of the skull, and it did not make a particularly large exit wound, I believe it made the exit wound seen in this image. This image was described as the posterior skull by the autopsy pathologist. In 1966, when the Kennedy family returned the autopsy photographs to the government, when they gave the photographs to the National Archives, the doctors were called in the next day. Dr. Humes, Dr. Boswell, and Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist, and Mr. Stringer, the photographer. They were told to make a catalog and just describe by title what is being seen in each image. The title they gave this photograph was The Posterior Skull, the Back of the Head. Now, Dr. Mantic, an associate of mine, has been to the archives 9 times. He's viewed the archives' autopsy materials 9 times, both the photographs and the x-rays, with the permission of the Kennedy family. He has examined this image stereoscopically with a stereoscopic viewer that he made himself. He put 2 transparencies in there that were almost identical and was able to see a 3D view of this image. This image is cropped somewhat at the top. The actual transparency in the archive shows more in its field of view than this image does. Dr. Mantic was able to observe that this has to be the rear of the head because at the top of the image he could see President Kennedy's chest. The president's lying on his back on the examining table. This is the top and right side and rear of the head gone in this image. And he could see the nipples on President Kennedy's chest in the 3D stereoscopic viewer and the abdominal fat pads which had been folded back. So through his personal viewing of the photographs, Dr. Mantic has confirmed that this is indeed the rear of the head and that the large cavity in the cranium is in the top and right rear of the head. Now, examining the image again, you'll notice that in the center of the image, there's a semicircular notch. It's a little bit out of focus, but there's a semicircular notch in the bone, and the scalp has been reflected back. The House Select Committee on Assassination's Forensic Pathology Panel identified that notch as forensic evidence of a bullet's exit. Forensic evidence of exit. In other words, it's cratering, and the cratering, the larger part of the hole, is on the outside of the skull. I conclude that this semicircular beveled notch is the exit wound for the bullet that entered right here. I don't believe this exit wound was seen at Parkland Hospital because I don't believe that the scalp underneath it was blown away from the body. I think that they were all focused on the one large head wound they could see, which was the massive void back in this area about the size of a baseball or an orange, which was devoid of scalp and skull. That's the one wound that they all fixated on and observed. So I believe that this exit wound went unobserved at Parkland Hospital. I believe this entrance wound went unobserved at Parkland Hospital because I think it was covered up by the president's bangs. The president had long hair in front, much longer than mine. It was very thick, and I think that's why they didn't see this entrance wound right in the hairline, because it was obscured by the president's bangs. I think it's a reasonable conclusion to make. Now, there's one aspect about this photograph that's very troubling, and most people don't really understand it, and I'm going to explain this controversy to you so that you understand the sleight of hand that's going on here with the U.S. government. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, their forensic pathology panel, decided to reorient this photograph, and they never told anyone when they wrote their report what they had done. They never told you that the autopsy doctors and the autopsy radiologist and the autopsy photographer had called this the posterior skull, the back of the head. They described this photograph as the right front of the head. So the House Select Committee on Assassinations and the Clark panel, which preceded them, Ramsey Clark was Attorney General, and in 1967 he assembled a panel to examine the autopsy materials, and in 1968 they wrote their report. The Clark panel decided that the semicircular beveled notch, yes, it's an exit wound, but that it's right here. But that the exit point was here, and the Clark panel and the HSCA panel, which rubber stamped the Clark panel's work, decided that this photograph really depicts this part of the skull, not the left rear. It's one thing for academics to disagree about something, but when they engage in a subterfuge and sleight of hand and withhold what they have done from the American people, it's really dishonest. The House Select Committee published an entire volume, Volume 7, about the medical evidence and their findings. Never once in that volume did they explain that their panel had reoriented this photo and that they disagreed with the description made by the people who were actually at the autopsy. Well, I choose to believe the people who were at the autopsy. Drs. Humes, Dr. Boswell, Dr. Ebersol, and John Stringer, the photographer, said this was the back of the head. Dr. Mantic has confirmed it. Paul O'Connor, one of the Navy enlisted autopsy technicians who assisted the autopsy doctors that night, confirmed prior to his death that this is indeed an image of the back of the head and that the huge cavity is in the top of the head and the right rear of the head. So I choose to believe the people who were present in the Bethesda morgue that this is an image of the back of the head, and I believe the HSCA panel's conclusion that yes, this is evidence of exit. The beveled notch is evidence of exit, but it's an exit wound in the left rear of the skull up high. Therefore, it's evidence of a shot from the front. If you have an exit wound in the rear of the skull, it's another way of saying that the president was shot from the front. So that's my interpretation of what this photograph really means. If you read the Clark panel report or the HSCA medical volume, they'll tell you this is the right front of the skull. I don't believe it. And the HSCA panel was intellectually dishonest by not telling its audience that they had